Welcome, everybody. This is VCF Musketeers episode number 1. And this podcast is going to cover everything around how businesses utilize or planning to utilize VMware Cloud Foundation. In today's episode, we have John Arrasjid as a guest. Welcome, John. Why don't you quickly introduce yourself?
Oh, greetings, Eve. I have been a VMware employee going back to 2003, took a little bit of time off working at Dell and a few other companies before returning, and now part of Broadcom. I have background in with the VCDX program, obviously, and working with a lot of our education and certification teams, as well as the Broadcom Knights program as well.
Good, and you are actually VCDX number 1, so the perfect guest for the first episode of this podcast. So when it comes to VCF, so a bit like the elevator pitch, if you run into anyone, why every enterprise should actually use VMware Cloud Foundation for their private cloud?
There's a lot of reasons. Many people in the past have built what they consider their own private cloud based on VMware technologies. But what we've done over the last couple of years now under Broadcom is actually bring everything together. So in the last decade, maybe a little bit longer, we've seen people chasing the cloud, looking for the agility, scalability, simplicity, cost savings, and all of that. But many have realized that the public cloud alone doesn't fit the workload or every governance model. Now, what we've done with VCF or VMware Cloud Foundation is deliver a true private cloud experience that you would expect from the public cloud, but all in your own data center, allowing you to modernize your data center, allowing you to run different types of workloads, not just the traditional monolithic workloads that many people are familiar with, but also containers, and also now with AI workloads, getting you all the same capabilities that we've had with traditional workloads in the past. But my key point here is it's not about necessarily replacing the cloud, but it's about extending the cloud operating model to where your data lives, meaning whether you want to have that private cloud experience on-prem or within a colo facility, you can own all of that. And it's about that operating model to make sure that you're successful and get the right pricing, get the right agility, and actually meet the demands that your business has.
And I think that's perfectly where VCF fits in, because I mean, we made a good living out of being a professional services company for the last 20 years, out of taking all of these individual building blocks. But that was also one of the challenges most companies had, is getting the cloud up and running was kind of a tedious task. You had all of these little bits of pieces and components, and also, due to the flexibility on the other side, people try to actually mix products from different vendors, and that added complexity. And then we all have been there and actually seen it's like, okay, it initially worked, but then you had to do an upgrade or something failed. And all of a sudden, you needed to figure out how to make this work. And even if you stick just with the VMware pieces, it was quite a hassle to go through. It's like, if I remember, especially with Cloud Director, for example, it's like sometimes these upgrade scenarios, it felt like a complete wall on the whiteboard on all the different steps and pieces. And I think that is really what truly makes the integrated suite. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit more as well. It's like, how do you see the business value for having all of that now finally integrated and really, I mean, VMware had VCF before, but before it was basically more like a piece of glue trying to piece it together. And now it's basically suite first and then individual products second.
Exactly. That was one of the things that we've been challenged with for a long time. So back in 2010 or so, I worked on what was called the vCloud Architecture Toolkit, where it was our first stage of what eventually became VCF. It was the vCloud Director. Now, the way I would look at that integrated suite is it allows customers to move from managing individual parts, as you described, to managing performance. How do you ensure that you give the workload all of the resources that are necessary to meet your SLAs? I think a lot of people may overlook VCF because it's not just the VMware products. It's an integrated software-defined stack, just like in the cloud. So vSphere for the software-defined compute, vSAN for software-defined storage, NSX for the networking side, and then ARIA as the suite that actually ties everything together, and automation give you much more flexibility in actually managing the environment and minimizing the, I'll call it, the level of effort for the SREs for a lot of the mundane tasks.
Yeah, speaking about VCF automation, that is kind of like the, on one hand, the hidden secret, which actually brings in the end some of what people expect from a user interface, like your self-service portal and stuff like that. But it also, on the other side, from my perspective, helps companies to actually to really build company applications and platforms so that you can actually deliver the true cloud solution to your users when it comes to self-service, but also things like approval procedures and all of the things. Because in the end, it's not only anymore around running a virtual machine or even running a container. In the end, as we talk in this podcast far more about business, in the end user doesn't really care about the platform on how you run it as much as we as infrastructure people hate to agree to that. But I think the most important part is people use applications, and people use, from that perspective, the outcome from an IT perspective to actually really get to their results. Because in the end, the office worker or even the developer doesn't care anymore. It's like they don't want to install operating systems or anything like that anymore.
Yep. So there's a couple of things that I look at now. VCF, with especially with the 901 releases, automation is a key part of that to actually do the management, the day-to-day operations, the updates, the upgrades. Think of lifecycle automation as that unsung hero. When you patch the full stack, that's the network, the storage, the compute, the management pieces, it's going from the firmware to the hypervisor and beyond. And this is all now done with a single click. In the past, we had different management interfaces, we had different steps, we had to make sure that the sequence of ordering of upgrades was done correctly. And then the other big one was dealing with the, I'll call it maintenance mode or the downtime that might be needed for doing those upgrades. So now we've got a single click. We actually identify all the sequencing of all the different pieces together when you're doing the full stack, but you can still do the individual components as well. But this actually gives you less firefighting and giving you more innovation. And think about it this way: automation means faster provisioning. So those development times, as you were describing, don't have to wait for weeks. They can get their infrastructure set up in minutes based on the service catalogs that are provided by the management team with VCF.
And I think that's very important. But also, as we all know, once you build cloud and things like that, there comes the kind of the next challenge in this whole game, which is just like, okay, so how do we now manage performance and cost from the other side? Because in the end, if you let your users free and actually give everybody, it's like, hey, you can pick and choose, you can actually deploy how much you want. In the end, what people got with the public cloud was there was the bill. I mean, no one really liked the bill, but it actually gave companies also the ability to see which department is using how much resources, where do we have the performance gaps. And I think this is where then VCF operations comes into play. We had that for a long period, and it was actually in many of the customer talks I did in the last year and a half now with Broadcom, is a lot of it was around, is like, yeah, we always wanted to have operations, but it really was not in our bill of material, and we could never convince anyone to buy it. But finally, we get that, and finally, we get that kind of cost and performance control.
Yeah, well, I'd like to tell you a story because sometimes that's the best way to kind of give you an example of this. So I have one customer that has had vSphere for a long time, many, many years, and they had always looked at getting ARIA operations in the past, vRealized operations, but they weren't able to get that approved, for their stack. Once VCF got rolled out and they moved to from vSphere to VCF, the full stack, they actually, the very first thing that they adopted was VCF operations. Again, we called it ARIA operations still, about, a year or two ago. But the key here is this is where you can help with the ROI greatly. One, you can manage your resources, identify where there are potential problems, add on additional rules to actually help with managing peak loads situations and things like that. But the integration with ARIA gives that visibility across capacity for your planning purposes and also for resizing. It covers performance, so you can make sure that your SLAs are met. In some cases, in the financial industry, you may have anywhere from 6 to 7 nines of availability, which is pretty high. And we can do a lot of that within the environment that we have. But the other area is on cost. Now, there are two different ways that we can look at cost. There's the VCF element, and of course, there's the other technology that we've had that's still available. It's called Cloud Health that allows you to look at costing in the cloud. But let's focus on operations. And this is where I'll say the CIOs, the CTOs, or the leaders in the for the SRE teams, the people that are doing day two operations, they love it because they can now do optimization. In fact, they can do self-optimizing. So based on rules, find ways to actually improve. We already have DRS, for example. That's something that's already built in, but we've also added on more AI to actually support not only just the current technology, but what's coming over the next couple of years. And so with operations, you can see the workload cost. You can learn how to rebalance for performance or identify if you have I'll call it out of compliance or older hardware that needs to be refreshed. And then also being able to simulate future demand by looking at what if scenarios. And I think that's the key. So we've got the software defined pieces, but the operations and the automation are two of the major pieces that really tie everything together and make VCF a powerful private cloud solution.
And I think that's actually a huge component in comparison to what all of the other ones out there on the market bring to the table, especially as, I mean, you come from the Broadcom side, I come from the external side. This tool can also help companies identify where they potentially have underutilized infrastructure. So instead of having to buy new cores, and I know we all like to grow the infrastructure, but in the end, it's all about cost management on the other side. And with that, you finally have a tool which is also going to help you identify, hey, here's a bunch of VMs which seem to be not really utilized, so we can potentially reduce them. We can potentially reduce the amount of cores they are utilizing, freeing up resources for other workloads before you need to expand into new territories. So from that perspective, I think it's also a great tool to really manage what you are going to get out of the infrastructure and really get what you pay for, because that is the biggest argument is always like it's all about cost, especially in the current time, economic wise. Nowhere, wherever we go, look around the globe, everybody talks about cost. How do we bring costs down? I mean, even in the talks Hawk made about why companies moving back from public cloud into private cloud, a huge component out of that is cost. Is people want to know what they are paying for, and people also have made their experiences with the public clouds and also learning is you cannot just compare the cost of a virtual machine, which was the biggest mistake most people made. It's like, hey, let's just look what an EC2 instance on Amazon or Microsoft VM costs. It's like there are so many other additional services all around it, which add up to the cost, and some of them can be quite costly. And this is where we bring all of that together for the on-prem scenario. And you can also, to a certain degree, at least make comparisons on like, how much does it cost me to run this workload on-prem, and how much does it cost me to move that?
And we have to look at hardware and software costs. We have to look at OpEx costs. We have to look at support costs. All of those come into play. People, process, and the actual technology are all, just like we've always said, essential to look at all of those pieces together. And I think as we go forward, one of the key things that a lot of people have realized is when you look at the core pricing, there is list pricing, but there are also discounts, and there is also the value of each of the individual components, and that's the biggest piece. The customers that I see adopting the majority of the stack, let's say you only pick 3 or 4 of the elements. Let's say it's vSphere, vSAN, and ARIA. Let's say that's the starting point. That already gives you a huge value on what you're paying for the full stack. Now you add on the other pieces for the developer with VKS and the full stack of the tools. The second area is some of the additional features that we've added with version 9. That includes the NVMe memory sharing. We no longer can support Optane because that's been dropped by Intel. But with NVMe, we have the ability to provide a way to have double the capacity, for example, where half of the capacity is used for the workloads that are cold or moving to cold. They're not actually active. And then the higher performant ones can go with the higher cost memory. This gives you that mixed model to give you a better pricing and better capability to support those different workload requirements. Yeah.
So I think that's a good point. The other thing is what people and you just said, it's like people can easily start with vSphere, vSAN, and ARIA because that's something which doesn't necessarily involve any changes. What we see, however, on the other side is that people start looking more and more looking back into network and security. NSX has always been like this hidden gem which had been everywhere. And let's face it, we have seen many companies who actually bought NSX but never really fully adopted to it because just the complexity of deploying it manually on each hypervisor and all of that. And most of that is now completely gone with VCF. And especially if you use just the, let's say, easier features of NSX, you don't even need to go that deep into NSX anymore. And it really makes it easier for people because in many cases in modern enterprises, a good amount of the workloads is running within the virtual infrastructure. So you can fully utilize NSX from that perspective. But also when it comes down to security, the pure fact that we can utilize microsegmentation is going to be a huge differentiator. And that is especially when we look into, I mean, VMware played this NSX microsegmentation game for quite a while. And I have seen enough other vendors who say we can do microsegmentation. In many cases, what they call microsegmentation is so far off from what VMware can actually do, because it either has some modules you need to install in the operating system, which adds complexity, it becomes a compliance issue and a bunch of other things, or it can't go as deep as it can here. And also, as much as everybody loves cloud native and modern web applications, we also see every time Microsoft discontinues a server operating system, how many companies actually shout out, it's like, oh, you can't discontinue Windows 2008. And, it's like, that the 2008 is not an abstract version number. That was the year it came out. It's like that product already nearly turned 18 by now. So you should really that. But it is a reality. People have legacy applications, especially when we look into the manufacturing industry. But also, I mean, you do a lot of banking. And I know, at least in Europe, in a lot of banks, there are enough legacy applications running here and there. And microsegmentation can really be a helpful tool to secure these workloads, which is very, very difficult if you want to try to do that with anything else, especially if you don't know everything about the application in the first place, which in some cases is the older it is not only a problem that it's there, but the other problem is most people don't really know what it does.
Yeah, I think the big change that we've taken, and I think others are starting to follow this, is we've always, I think, looked at how do we ensure security of the workload. Yes, it's great to have security of the infrastructure. That's important. Maybe we put a firewall up, we put some other things up. But the idea here is having the security follow the workload, and that's what VCF does. Now, we look at it as not being an add-on. Now, there is microsegmentation and zero trust components built into NSX, and then there's advanced capabilities within DFW as an add-on. So the idea here is giving a big differentiator for what we can offer with VCF for regulated industries or data sensitive environments, but that can apply to any other company, not just the banking industry, but also manufacturing, retail, and other areas as well. I think that's the key thing. How can we ensure that the security follows the workload, not just at the edges of the infrastructure?
Going from legacy applications on the one hand side, we have another topic, which is actually, it came up at UserCon. I was at the Dallas UserCon a few weeks ago, and one of the attendees actually approached me and said, it's like, yeah, we don't need all the VCF stuff. We are just a vSphere only stuff shop. And I went, it's like, so what do you do? And he says, it's like, yeah, we are a legal firm. And I said, it's like, so if you're a legal firm, then please explain to me, how are you going to address the AI topic for yourself? Because clearly a lot of the data your customers bring to you, they don't want to see end up somewhere in the cloud. On the other side, especially for legal firms, but also for many other industries, there is a huge advantage out of utilizing all the knowledge, especially when we look at the American court system, which heavily depends on that you have access to all previous court cases which have ever happened in the United States, which is, I mean, they always had databases for the last 15, 20 years, but it was very tedious to really figure out the exact case you could actually link back to this scenario. And I said, it's like, why don't we talk about private AI? And he says, it's like, yeah, for us, our developers try to build something, but it's really complex and it's very hard for us to maintain. And I said, it's like, yeah, then we should potentially start a VCF discussion again, because what your people try to do is, on one hand, a mixture out of getting Kubernetes and all of that up and running and then build private AI. And let's face it, you're a legal firm, you're not an IT company. Maybe you should just actually use something which gives you all the functionalities from an infrastructure perspective without you having to build, on one hand, the Kubernetes part, but also the private AI part.
Yeah, so let's talk about private AI from two angles. The first one I'll take is on the infrastructure side, and I'll have a little bit shorter on that. If I look at AI in particular for infrastructure components, we can actually now, with large language models and using some agentic AI, basically take those large language models that have knowledge base articles, documentation, and other areas to actually help troubleshoot issues, to also help with making better informed decisions based on the environment that you have, as well as that additional information that we have collected from all the different customers we've had over the years. It's all sanitized, but the idea is, if there's a particular situation, we have opportunity to actually take advantage of that instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. So on the infrastructure side, we're adding AI, we're adding in the ability to have natural language discussion. So for example, maybe there's a manager who may not be as technical as some of the people on the team, but they want to look into some and do a little bit more research without knowing all the keywords. We're taking care of that on the infrastructure side. But at the same point, we're doing the other side where I want to spend a little more time. That's on private AI for those that are people that are doing development. I hear this from the banking industry. I hear this from some of the other industries as well, where they're all trying to develop agentic AI. They may be adding on natural language processing as well, and they're looking at tools. So NVIDIA has their AI enterprise solution, which can be integrated with our private AI foundation, which is included as part of VCF. We also are doing this with Intel and AMD. There's different types of technologies there, but the idea is we want to give the ability to have private AI deliver the ability to have data proximity to where you need to actually do the compute and where the memory and everything else is, but also trust in that data. So one of the things that we're doing is we're giving the ability to train or fine-tune models close to the data without exposing externally. And to your point, some customers will use pre-built models, others build from scratch. It costs a lot more, it takes more time, but a lot of customers are looking at hybrid models. What can we use that's already out there? Do some sanitizing on that to get rid of any, I'll call it garbage for now, garbage in, garbage out. We want to make sure we don't have that. But also some of the other aspects of ensuring that you have access to a catalog of large language models that are approved by IT before the developers start consuming that. So, with AI enterprise, from NVIDIA integration, you get that GPU management, you get policy driven governance right inside that private cloud that you have. And on top of it, we're going to continue to develop this, not just with NVIDIA, but with those other solutions that AMD, Intel, and potentially others provide as well. And that's on the software side. On the hardware side, Broadcom is doing other things that are enabling many others, not just us on the VMware division, but others with the networking capabilities, with some of the other things that we're doing with, we call them XPUs, but they're like GPUs or TPUs, but custom designed ASICs or FPGAs for specific use cases. And as you've probably seen in the news the last couple of quarters, we've announced a lot about partnerships with each of these different companies that are growing that side of the business. And I think together, this is going to work really positive for the industry, having hardware and software, not necessarily because it's under one company, but thinking about how to do the integration of the physical to the virtual to the cloud.
Yeah, I think that building that bridge on the one hand side is important, but also really for people to understand on how to build a private AI. I think for many companies they are still in the starting scenario where they play with simplistic tools, where they play around with LLMs. But as companies are starting to utilize more and more of these services internally, people also figure out that on one hand side running it all in the cloud might not necessarily be the most cost effective way for them, but also from a privacy security perspective, it's an impact. I mean, just the shocking order of what was it, 38 billion, which
Mhm.
AI just
Yeah.
signed with AWS. Was like, I guess the sales rep is pretty happy now, but other than that, this shows how much goes into these infrastructures, and in
Mhm.
reality, most likely, I mean, ChatGPT and some of the things OpenAI does is a completely different ball game. But for many corporations, it's a much smaller model. You do not necessarily need to spend that much. You do not necessarily need to build that. If you just look into what people currently already build with these first NVIDIA Sparks boxes, I mean, that has nothing to do with VCF, but that's basically like a very small box on your desktop, which can do a lot of AI
Yeah.
work at a very fast pace. Um, and these are the things which we will see moving forward is that a lot of that comes back. And you see more and more applications which will just require AI components to run and operate. Because even if I look at our ERP system, it's like AI bubbles up in nearly
Yeah.
every quarter of it. And at one point in time, I'm already expecting, because it runs in the cloud, that going to get a nice, interesting bill. And we see this with also with other software vendors. It's like our CRM vendor, for example, had AI enabled in the beginning. A couple of weeks, the first announcements, you now have AI credits, and now it basically is like, oh yeah, this agent costs this agent
Yeah.
costs this. So people will figure out that AI, there is money behind this, because all the discussions we see with all the data centers being built, all the power being generated for AI, sooner or later someone has to pay the bill for that, and
Yeah.
people
And if we can reduce that, help reduce that cost or be more optimal in the data center, that's going to be a big win. There's one other thing too I'd like to add real quick. When we look at building those AI solutions, in many cases they're container based, right? The workloads. And one of the things that we've really tried to do, I think going back to the pivotal days, this is going back what 10 years maybe or maybe longer, we made a huge investment. We made an investment into a number of different technologies that were related to Kubernetes and Kubernetes projects. That was our choice at the time. And because of that, we're one of the top three contributors to the Kubernetes project, as well as some of the sub projects. And I think that's an important one because we've invested a lot, because we also believe that not only investing in the open source area, it actually helps drive us to be more successful with our customers who are using, in some cases, they might even be using Spring, for example. That's another piece where we do support for. But there's all these different elements related to not just the AI workloads, but the other types of container based workloads that there's a lot of advantage and a lot of history that we can bring to the table to help customers, in that success.
And I think that's actually a good point. Is the investment VMware or Broadcom before has been doing into Kubernetes is huge, and this is always whenever people come, it's like, yeah, with the Broadcom acquisition, we should clearly switch to open source. Where I go is like, yeah, you should better than actually check on quite a few of the projects you're jumping into, because you might actually see them pretty quickly back. And I mean, we have seen many companies do that. Oracle has been a big contributor to many open source projects. As much as people don't want
Yep.
to talk much about it, open source, especially when it comes to huge and more important components, would not work without the commercial software space behind it. As
Yep.
much as, and I have been involved in several startups in the open source world, etc. Is many people in open source think it's just self-sustainable. No, it's not self-sustainable, because also a lot of the support charging models and everything else don't work as easily as people think. There
Yeah.
is no matter a reason why Red Hat being one of the real big exceptions of being successful in the commercial open source space. It's not that many who actually got to that point because
Yeah.
it is a challenge to go there. But we covered a lot. Maybe to close it off, what would you say to a CIO basically who is a bit on the fence between VCF and picking something else out there on the market?
That one's an easy one because I've gone through that a few times. I mean, it may be easy for me, maybe not everyone will agree with this, but when I look at VCF as an investment, I first look and I would ask the CIO, currently, do you have a center of excellence where you have multiple different teams, technology teams, coming together and having common ground? And that COE would have the people from the storage, the networking, the compute, the applications, security, and other areas working together. What I would say to that CIO is VCF is an investment in operational maturity. It gives you a consistent hybrid cloud model. It's one that's secure. We are, I mean, I think we're recognized for how quickly we try to respond to security alerts and get those addressed. But it's one that's secure. It's automated. It's cost predictable, and it's not really about a rip and replace of what you have. It's about future proofing what you already have. So if you have vSphere and maybe only one or two other components, this is growing that to be a full suite under one umbrella, which actually will help your teams become more interactive with each other and supporting each other on the decisions as you go forward instead of having silos that can pose some challenges.
We heard already you're pretty much into the private AI stuff, but what's the most underrated feature? What is the hidden gem and secret which is overlooked so often in your space?
There are a few different areas. I think they're becoming more and more visible now. One of them is NVMe memory tiering for reducing the amount of data that you might need to have, the investment that you might need to have to basically have everything high performant. So in the case of cold pages, those can it's not quite the same as swapping, but I would consider it a similar concept where, hey, this VM hasn't been using these code pages. We can swap them out. But there's another piece that a lot of people miss out. They've heard about the NVMe memory tiering. They've heard about in the past Optane as part of that memory tiering. What they may not have looked at is the deep dive. We look at 4K blocks of memory. We only keep one copy. So similar to what we would do with some of the other solutions, we try to minimize the amount of duplication, which can provide a faster cache ratio, hit ratio, as well as other performance increases. That's one area I would say. The other area I would say is something that many customers have used, but I think many have also looked at alternative solutions like clustering, and that's Site Recovery Manager. When I was at VMware, probably 10 years ago, that was a huge piece. And we use it for everything from disaster recovery to data center migrations and so on. There's a lot of technologies like SRM and NVMe that have a primary use case, but they also have additional use cases. I think that's probably, I guess I'll say, uh, the one that people haven't dove deepest into. Private AI is the big one, but NVMe memory tiering fits into that. Some of the other technologies that I mentioned have also fit into that as well.
Great. Thank you, John.
Wait, one more before I finish though. So the other key one, I think, is on NSX. So if we look at how NSX abstracts and it secures the network fabric, it's more than just networking. It's the foundation for zero trust. It's the foundation for multi-tenancy and even for AI data isolation, meaning how do you protect that confidential data, from being exposed, not only externally, but also to maybe groups within your company that shouldn't have access to it. Things like financial metrics, personal information related to employees, and so on. But anyway, sorry, I'll stop with that because I think we covered a lot.
We clearly covered a lot. I think this is going to be the first episode. Most likely is going to be the first one, which is already over time. But I think that's good because it gives kind of a very good starting point, because some of the speakers we are going to have in some of the next sessions are going to deep dive into some of these bits and pieces individually. We'll have at one point Chris McCain is going to talk really lengthy about the network security story. Chris Wolf actually says already he's going to make a deep dive into private AI. We are going to have quite a few other people actually deep dive into the individual pieces, and therefore I think this is a very good starting point, because we covered basically everything around it as much as we can in this time. Before we close it off for today, any closing summary note or anything you wanna say we didn't cover yet?
Well, having worked with our cloud solutions since vCloud Director back around 2010 timeframe to today with VCF, the 5.2, and then now with the 9.x, I think people need to look at it as not just a product. VCF is more of a strategy. It's how enterprises can modernize without starting over. Yeah, you have vSphere. You may not have all the other components, but you have the starting point, and it's much easier to extend based on that, based on the experience you have. And it's how I think the cloud operating model can actually become something that you, as an owner of VCF, can actually take back, reduce some of your costs, be more efficient in what you're doing, and actually drive success for your business goals.
Thank you. Thank you for joining today. I think this is going to be a great starting point, and maybe we revisit together this whole story once the next major release comes out or something else pops up. Thank
That's
you, John,
a great
for
idea.
today.
As always, thank you so much. Looking forward to talking to you again. Have a good one.